It started with a look I can't forget, a look that felt like it saw straight through me. I never expected her visit to change anything. She was just my niece, staying for a while because her parents were away. But from the moment she walked through my door, there was something in the way she smiled, something in the way her eyes lingered a second too long, that unsettled me. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading into nothing, but each day it became harder to ignore. Little things kept catching me off guard, the brush of her hand when she passed me a plate, the way her voice softened when she said my name, the quiet moments when we'd lock eyes and neither of us would speak. I didn't know what was happening between us, but deep down, I knew I wasn't going to stop it. The rain had been falling all afternoon, a soft steady rhythm against the windows, the kind of weather that made the house feel smaller and quieter than usual. I was in the kitchen making tea when I heard the knock at the door. I knew she was coming, of course. Her parents had asked if she could stay for a few weeks while they traveled, but something about seeing her standing there with her suitcase in hand caught me off guard. She looked older than the last time I saw her, more grown, but still carrying that spark of mischief in her smile. Her hair was damp from the rain, strands clinging to her cheeks, and when she stepped inside, she brought with her the scent of cold air and wet earth. We hugged, and it was quick, casual, nothing unusual. But when she pulled away, her eyes stayed on mine for a second too long. It was such a small thing that I almost convinced myself I imagined it. We settled into the rhythm of her visit easily enough. She was talkative, curious, and she seemed determined to fill the house with life. We cooked together the first night, pasta with too much garlic because she laughed every time I told her to stop chopping. We ate at the small table by the window, the rain still tapping against the glass, and talked about little things at first, her classes, her friends, the trip her parents were on. But as the night went on, the conversation deepened. She asked about my work, my past relationships, even the breakup I'd had a year ago. I didn't share much about that with people, but her way of listening made it easy to talk. She didn't interrupt. She didn't judge. She just looked at me, and every so often her lips would curve into this small knowing smile, like she understood something I wasn't saying. Later, when we moved to the couch with our mugs of tea, the air between us felt different. We didn't sit too close, but it wasn't the kind of space that made you feel apart. It was warm, almost charged, though I tried to ignore the thought. The television played quietly in the background, but I wasn't paying attention. My focus kept shifting to the way she curled her legs beneath her, the way she tilted her head when she laughed, the way her eyes kept finding mine in the flickering light of the screen. At one point, she leaned over to grab a blanket from the back of the couch, and when she draped it across us both, I felt the weight of it, the heat of her leg brushing against mine. I told myself it was nothing, just a blanket, just a bit of closeness between family. But I noticed how she didn't shift away, and I didn't either. As the hours passed, I became more aware of the little pauses in our conversation, those moments where neither of us spoke but we kept looking at each other, holding the silence like it meant something. I felt a strange pull, the kind that sits low in your stomach and makes you suddenly aware of your own breathing. It wasn't something I wanted to admit, not even to myself. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and replayed the evening in my mind. I thought about her laugh, her eyes, the way she'd brushed her fingers against mine when she passed me her mug. It had been so brief, so casual, but it stayed with me. My mind kept circling back to her, to the way I felt sitting beside her under that blanket, to the warmth of her presence filling the room. I should have been thinking about all the reasons it didn't matter, all the reasons it shouldn't matter. But I wasn't. I was thinking about how, for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. I told myself I'd keep my distance, that I wouldn't let anything happen, that I was in control. But even as I made those promises in the quiet darkness of my room, I knew deep down they were lies I was telling myself. Because already, after just one day, she was in my head in a way I couldn't ignore. And something in me didn't want to ignore it at all. The days began to slide into a quiet routine, each one feeling both ordinary and strange at the same time. She would wake earlier than me, padding softly through the hallway in her socks, making coffee in my kitchen like she had always belonged there. Sometimes I would watch her from the doorway before she noticed me, the way the morning light spilled through the window and caught in her hair, the way she would hum absent-mindedly to herself while pouring milk into her cup. It was simple, almost domestic, and yet it stirred something inside me I didn't quite want to name. We spent our mornings lazily, reading at opposite ends of the couch or chatting over breakfast, and I found myself looking forward to those small moments more than I should. One afternoon, we decided to bake cookies. The kitchen filled with the smell of vanilla and sugar, and she laughed every time flour ended up on my face or in my hair. At one point, she reached over to brush a streak of flour from my cheek, and her fingers lingered for a beat too long. I smiled and looked away, pretending to focus on the mixing bowl, but my chest tightened with a feeling that wasn't entirely comfortable. It was becoming harder to convince myself that these moments meant nothing. Even the silences between us felt charged now. At night, after dinner, we would curl up in the living room. She always seemed to choose the spot right next to me, close enough that her leg would brush against mine, close enough that I could smell her perfume, light and warm, mixed with the faint scent of her shampoo. We talked about everything and nothing, her life at school, my work, the places she wanted to travel. There was an openness in her that drew me in, a way she asked questions and listened so intently that I found myself telling her things I hadn't told anyone in years. One night, she asked me if I missed being in love. The question hung in the air, and I didn't answer right away. I told her I did, though it had been a long time since I felt it. She tilted her head, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read, and then she smiled in a way that made my heart skip, like she knew something I didn't. There was a shift after that, subtle but undeniable. She started to seek me out more, lingering in the kitchen when I cooked, leaning on the counter just to talk, following me into the garden while I watered the plants. She would laugh easily, tease me about small things, but there were moments when the laughter would fade and the quiet between us would feel heavy with something unsaid. I tried to shake it off, to remind myself of the boundaries that existed, the lines that shouldn't be crossed. But the truth was, I had been lonely for so long. My life had been a quiet, predictable thing, work, sleep, weekends spent in solitude. Her presence filled the spaces in my home and in my mind, and I found myself craving it, even when I knew I shouldn't. One evening after dinner, we stayed at the table long after the plates had been cleared, sipping tea while the room grew dim around us. She rested her chin on her hand and watched me talk, her eyes warm and unblinking. The way she looked at me made my throat tighten, made me forget what I was saying. I broke eye contact, staring into my cup, but I could still feel her gaze on me, almost like a touch. When I finally looked up again, she was still watching, and she smiled slowly, like she could see right through me. That night, lying in bed, I thought about her more than I wanted to. I remembered the way her laughter sounded, the way her eyes softened when she was listening, the warmth in the air when we sat close together. I told myself I was reading too much into it, that it was all just in my head. But deep down, I knew something was changing between us, something I couldn't ignore for much longer. And though I didn't know where it would lead, I also knew one thing for certain: I didn't want her visit to end. The storm rolled in without warning that evening, the sky darkening far earlier than usual, heavy clouds pressing low over the rooftops. The air felt charged, restless, and the wind rattled the windows like impatient fingers. I had been in the kitchen, washing the last of the dinner dishes, when the first crack of thunder shook the house. She appeared in the doorway a moment later, her eyes bright, holding 2 candles she had found in the cupboard. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, leaving us in a sudden hush broken only by the rain beginning to pound against the roof. She lit the candles, the soft glow painting her face in warm gold and deep shadow. For a moment, I simply looked at her, caught off guard by how intimate the light made the space feel. We moved into the living room, placing the candles on the coffee table, their flames bending gently in the draft. The television was dead, the hum of the refrigerator gone, and without the background noise of electricity, the quiet between us seemed louder, heavier. She pulled the blanket from the back of the couch and sat close, not touching it first, but near enough that I could feel her presence as surely as the warmth of the candles. The conversation started lightly, jokes about the power outage, stories about storms she remembered from her childhood, but as the minutes passed, it deepened in a way I couldn't have predicted. She asked me about my past, not just the facts I usually offered but the truths I kept tucked away. She wanted to know about the women I had loved, the ones who had broken my heart, and the reasons I had chosen to live alone. I hesitated, but the storm outside felt like it had closed us off from the rest of the world, and in that cocoon of rain and shadows, I found myself answering her honestly. I told her about the woman I had thought I would spend my life with, how it had ended, and how I had built walls so high I didn't think anyone could climb them again. She listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, her fingers curled loosely around the edge of the blanket we shared. When I fell silent, she shifted closer, the fabric between us pulling tight. I could feel the warmth of her leg against mine, and it made my breath hitch. She tilted her head slightly, studying me as if weighing her next words. "You don't seem as closed off as you think you are," she said softly, and the way she said it made my chest tighten. There was no teasing in her tone, no casualness. It was like she saw something in me I had tried to hide even from myself. The rain was louder now, drumming against the roof, thunder rumbling like a distant warning. I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. She reached out then, slowly, deliberately, and placed her hand over mine. It was a small gesture, but it felt enormous. My first instinct was to pull away, to remind her, and myself, of where the lines were. But I didn't. I let her hand rest on mine, her thumb brushing lightly against my skin in a way that made my pulse throb in my ears. We sat like that for a long moment, not speaking, our eyes locked. There was a question in hers, one I didn't dare answer out loud. The moment might have stretched on forever if not for a sharp flash of lightning that illuminated the room and made her jump, her fingers tightening around mine. She laughed quietly at herself, but she didn't let go, and neither did I. Eventually, she leaned back, though her hand lingered until the very last second before slipping away. We didn't speak much after that, both of us aware that something had shifted but unwilling to name it. The storm went on into the night, and even after I went to bed, I could still feel the ghost of her touch against my skin. I lay awake listening to the rain, my mind replaying the way she had looked at me, the way her voice had softened, the way the space between us had seemed to disappear. I told myself it was just a moment brought on by the weather, by the intimacy of candlelight and shared memories. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Something had started, and whatever it was, I wasn't sure I wanted to stop it. The morning after the storm, the world outside looked freshly washed, the streets still damp and glistening, the air carrying that sharp clean scent that only comes after heavy rain. The sunlight streamed through the curtains in soft golden ribbons, and for a moment everything felt almost too peaceful, as if the night before had been nothing but a dream. But it hadn't been. I could still feel the echo of her hand on mine, still see the way her eyes had searched my face in the candlelight. We didn't talk about it. Over breakfast, she acted as if nothing unusual had happened, moving around the kitchen with that same ease she had settled into since arriving, pouring coffee for both of us without asking, teasing me about the way I always buttered my toast too thin. I found myself studying her in the morning light, noticing details I hadn't before, the faint curve of her collarbone where her shirt slipped a little, the tiny crease between her brows when she was concentrating on what she was saying. I caught myself looking too long and quickly shifted my gaze, afraid she might see too much in my expression. As the day went on, the rhythm of our time together resumed, but it was different somehow. There was a weight beneath every word, every laugh, every shared glance. The quiet moments were the most dangerous. Sitting together on the couch reading, her knee would brush mine just enough to make my skin warm, and neither of us would move away. Passing each other in the hallway, our arms would touch, and that brief contact would linger in my thoughts far longer than it should. I started noticing how often she found ways to close the space between us. If I was at the counter chopping vegetables, she'd come stand beside me, close enough that our elbows grazed. If I was reaching for something on a high shelf, she'd step in to steady me with her hand at my back, her touch light but deliberate. It was nothing anyone else would notice, but to me it felt deliberate, intentional in a way that made my heart race. That evening, we decided to watch a film. She chose it, something light and romantic, and I told myself not to read into that choice. But once we were settled on the couch, she curled herself into the corner nearest to me, draping the same blanket from the night before over both our legs. As the movie played, I found myself less focused on the screen and more aware of her beside me, the sound of her breathing, the faint scent of her shampoo whenever she shifted. Halfway through, she leaned her head slightly toward me, not quite resting it on my shoulder but close enough that the space between us felt fragile, like one small movement could erase it completely. I could feel the warmth radiating from her, and my chest felt tight, my breath shallow. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just sat there, caught in a strange mix of comfort and tension that left me feeling unsteady. When the movie ended, neither of us seemed eager to move. The credits rolled, the music soft and lingering, and she looked over at me with a faint smile. Her eyes held mine just a little too long, and I had the unsettling feeling that she was waiting for me to say something, to do something. But I didn't. Instead, I reached for the remote and turned off the television, breaking the moment before it could break me. Still, as I lay in bed later that night, staring at the ceiling in the dark, I could feel it, the pull between us growing stronger, the space between what we were and what we might become shrinking with every passing day. And though I told myself I needed to keep control, I could already sense that it was slipping from my grasp. It was a Friday evening when the tension between us shifted again, subtle at first, but enough that I could feel it in my chest like a slow, steady drumbeat. The week had been uneventful on the surface, me working from home, her exploring the neighborhood in the afternoons, the two of us sharing meals and quiet nights, but beneath it, something had been building, curling tighter with each passing day. That night she offered to open a bottle of wine she'd found in my cupboard, a dusty Merlot I had been saving for no reason other than habit. We sat at the kitchen table, the room dim except for the soft yellow light above us, the rain outside returning in a gentle patter against the windows. She poured for both of us, her fingers brushing mine when she handed me the glass, and that small touch felt louder than the rain. At first we talked casually, laughing over little stories and memories, but as the wine lowered in the bottle, our words slowed, our voices softened. She leaned forward with her elbows on the table, her face resting in her hands, looking at me in a way that made me feel seen in places I had kept hidden for so long. She asked me about my dreams, not the safe, practical answers people usually expect, but the kind of question that digs into the parts of you that still ache. I hesitated, swirling the wine in my glass, before admitting I hadn't thought much about dreams lately. I told her how life had felt like something I was enduring rather than living since my last heartbreak. She didn't interrupt, didn't fill the space with platitudes or empty reassurances. She just kept looking at me, her eyes soft but unwavering, and in that silence, I felt something inside me loosen. She began to talk about her own life then, her voice low, confessional. She told me about her doubts, her fears of not being enough, the way she sometimes felt disconnected from everyone around her. There was a vulnerability in her words that caught me off guard. It was strange and intoxicating, to sit there in the quiet of my kitchen, the rest of the world muffled by rain, and feel so unguarded with her. The pauses between our sentences grew longer, heavier. I could feel her eyes on me even when I looked away, tracing the curve of my jaw, the shape of my mouth. My pulse quickened, my skin warm beneath her gaze. When I finally looked back at her, she was smiling faintly, but there was something else in her expression, something deeper, almost daring. She reached across the table then, slow enough that I could have moved away, but I didn't. Her fingers brushed a loose strand of hair from my face, the pad of her thumb grazing my cheek. The touch was feather-light, but it sent a rush of heat through me, an ache that pooled in the pit of my stomach. I wanted to speak, to break the moment with something safe and ordinary, but my voice stayed caught in my throat. She didn't move her hand right away. For a few suspended seconds, we stayed like that, the world narrowed down to the space between us. Then she drew her hand back with a small, almost shy smile, as if she knew she had crossed a line but didn't regret it. I sat there, my glass of wine forgotten, my heart still beating too fast. We stayed at the table long after that, talking about lighter things but with an undercurrent neither of us acknowledged. When we finally moved to the couch, she sat close enough that our arms touched along their length, and neither of us shifted away. Later, after she had gone to bed and the house had gone quiet, I stood in the kitchen with my empty glass, staring out at the wet streetlights beyond the window. I knew exactly what was happening. I knew it was dangerous, that it would change everything if I let it. But the truth was, I could feel the last of my resistance slipping away, and part of me didn't want to stop it at all. The next few days blurred into something that felt almost like a secret rhythm only the two of us could hear, a slow, unspoken dance we were both pretending not to notice but never stopping. Every moment seemed to carry a charge now, even the most ordinary ones. If I was in the kitchen making coffee, she would appear beside me, leaning against the counter so close that our shoulders touched with every small movement. If I was reading on the couch, she would wander in, toss herself down next to me, and rest her bare feet lightly across my lap without asking. I told myself it was casual, playful, harmless, but each time, my body reacted before my mind could shut it down. One evening I was chopping vegetables for dinner, the sound of the knife against the cutting board steady, when I felt her come up behind me. She didn't say anything, just slipped her arms around my waist in a loose, lazy hug, her cheek resting lightly between my shoulder blades. The warmth of her body pressed against mine made me freeze for a second, knife hovering mid-air, my heart suddenly pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I could feel her slow, even breathing against my back, the subtle rise and fall in sync with my own, and for a moment I thought I might have to step away. But I didn't. I stood there, letting the quiet settle around us, letting her stay as long as she wanted. She gave me a small squeeze before letting go, moving around the kitchen like nothing had happened, but I was left rattled, my hands trembling slightly as I finished chopping. After dinner, we sat together in the living room, and the air between us felt heavier than usual. The TV flickered with some forgettable show neither of us was watching. She had curled up next to me, her thigh pressed fully against mine now, not just brushing by accident. At one point, she shifted the blanket so it covered both of us, tucking it in on my side like it was the most natural thing in the world. I could smell her again, that faint mix of floral shampoo and something warmer, something uniquely her. I kept my eyes on the screen, but my awareness of her beside me was sharp enough to drown out whatever was playing. The next day, we went for a walk in the park. It was sunny but cool, and we fell into step easily, talking about small things at first. She told me stories about her friends, her plans for the next semester, how she sometimes felt like she didn't quite belong anywhere. There was something in her tone that made me want to reach out, to take her hand, but I kept mine buried in my coat pockets. We stopped at a bench overlooking the pond, and she sat close enough that our knees touched. She didn't move away, and neither did I. The quiet between us then felt different, comforting, but also dangerous, like standing too close to the edge of something you can't see the bottom of. That night, I tried to keep my distance. I stayed in my bedroom longer than usual, reading, telling myself space was what I needed. But later, when I came out to get some water, I found her sitting cross-legged on the couch, wearing one of my old sweaters. She looked up at me with a smile that was small and almost shy, and without thinking, I crossed the room and sat beside her. We talked about nothing for a while, the kind of meandering conversation that feels both aimless and intimate. At some point, she shifted closer, leaning into me so our shoulders touched. Her hand rested near mine on the couch cushion, our fingers not quite touching, but close enough that I could feel the heat from her skin. I don't know how long we sat like that, not moving, barely speaking. Eventually she yawned, stretching, and her arm brushed against mine in a slow, deliberate way that made my breath catch. We said goodnight not long after, but lying in bed later, I could still feel every place our bodies had touched, still hear the soft lilt of her voice in the dim quiet of the living room. I told myself I had to pull back, that whatever this was couldn't go on forever without consequences. But the truth was, the more time we spent together, the less I wanted to imagine the house without her in it. And that realization was as frightening as it was irresistible. It was late, later than either of us usually stayed up, and the house had settled into that deep, still quiet that only comes in the small hours of the night. We had been watching an old movie, the kind you've seen so many times you don't need to follow the plot anymore, and the low glow from the television was the only light in the room. She was stretched out on the couch beside me, her legs folded underneath her, the blanket pulled around her waist. At some point during the film, she leaned over and rested her head lightly on my shoulder. It was such a small movement, so casual on the surface, but it sent a warm jolt through me that I tried desperately to ignore. I told myself not to read into it, not to shift or draw attention to the way my body had gone rigid for just a moment before slowly relaxing into the contact. Her hair smelled faintly sweet, and I could feel the gentle weight of her head, the steady rhythm of her breathing. For a long while, we stayed like that, both of us facing the screen but barely paying attention. My awareness of her was sharp, every tiny movement magnified, the way her fingers played idly with the edge of the blanket, the slow exhale that brushed against my arm. At one point, I glanced down, and she tilted her head just enough to meet my eyes. The look she gave me wasn't playful or teasing this time, it was searching, quiet, as if she was trying to read something in my expression. My chest tightened, and I didn't look away. There was a long pause, the kind where you can hear your own heartbeat in your ears, and then she shifted, just slightly, closing the last bit of space between us. Her hand moved to rest against my forearm, her touch light but steady, her thumb tracing an absent pattern against my skin. I didn't move away. I didn't speak. My breath had slowed, my body caught somewhere between tension and surrender. The movie's ending credits began to roll, the music soft and bittersweet, but neither of us moved to turn it off. Instead, she lifted her head, still looking at me, her face closer than it had ever been. I could see the tiny flecks of gold in her eyes, the curve of her mouth, the way her lips parted slightly as if she was about to speak. My mind screamed at me to stop, to say something safe, but my body stayed perfectly still. She leaned in the smallest bit more, and the air between us felt thick, charged. I could feel the heat radiating from her, could almost hear the unspoken words caught between us. Then, without warning, she closed the gap. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, just the softest brush of her forehead against mine, a slow, almost hesitant touch that made my stomach twist. We stayed like that, foreheads resting together, breathing each other's air. My hands had curled into fists in my lap, not because I wanted to push her away, but because I was holding myself back from something I wasn't sure I could take back. When she finally pulled back, it was only far enough to look at me again, her eyes searching mine. The sound of rain began against the windows, soft at first, then harder, as if the storm outside had been waiting for us. She didn't say a word, and neither did I. She just leaned back into my shoulder, her hand still resting against my arm, her breathing slow and even. We sat there for a long time after that, both of us pretending to watch the blank screen, both of us knowing that whatever line had existed before had now blurred into something else entirely. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling for hours, replaying the way she had looked at me, the weight of her touch, the closeness of her breath. It was no longer a question of if something would happen, it was a matter of when. And deep down, I knew that when it came, I wouldn't stop it. The days after that night passed in a kind of suspended reality, as if the rest of the world had quietly stepped back to give us space. Neither of us spoke about what had happened, but it lived in the air between us like a low hum, impossible to ignore. Every glance seemed to last a beat longer, every touch lingered just enough to leave its mark. I kept telling myself I should say something, draw a line, remind us both where we stood, but each time I thought about it, the words dissolved before they could form. One evening, we found ourselves in the living room again, the rain outside drumming steadily against the windows. The lights were low, and the glow from a single lamp painted the space in gold. She was curled up at one end of the couch, and I was at the other, but as we talked, she began to shift closer, inch by inch, as if testing the space between us. I didn't move away. We drifted into quieter conversation, the kind that leaves long pauses where you can hear the other person breathing. At one point, she reached for my hand without a word. Her fingers threaded through mine like it was the most natural thing in the world, her touch warm, steady. I looked at her, and she looked back at me with an openness I hadn't seen before, no teasing, no hesitation, just something raw and certain. The pull I had been fighting for weeks surged forward, and I knew in that moment that I was done resisting. She moved closer until our knees touched, and then, slowly, she leaned in. This time there was no brush of foreheads, no almost, her lips met mine in a kiss that was soft but deliberate, the kind that carries both question and answer. My breath caught, but I didn't pull away. I kissed her back, slow at first, tasting the faint trace of wine on her mouth, feeling the way her hand tightened around mine. The kiss deepened, not in urgency but in weight, every second a quiet acknowledgement of the boundary we had stepped over. When we finally pulled apart, the room felt impossibly quiet, as if even the rain outside had paused. She kept her forehead against mine, her eyes closed, her breathing uneven. I felt something inside me unravel, a knot I hadn't even realized had been there for years. We didn't rush to fill the silence. We didn't explain or justify. We just sat there, still holding hands, still close enough to feel each other's heartbeat. Later, when she rested her head on my shoulder and we sank into the stillness, I realized I didn't feel guilt in the way I thought I would. There was no sense of wrongness pressing on my chest, only a strange mix of calm and exhilaration, as if I had been standing in the dark for years and someone had finally lit a match. I knew what we had wasn't simple. I knew it would be judged, questioned, maybe even condemned. But in that moment, none of that mattered. I thought about all the years I had spent avoiding risk, choosing safety over desire, silence over honesty. I thought about how her presence had woken something in me I thought was gone for good. And I realized that I didn't mind. I didn't mind the danger, the uncertainty, the tangled truth of what we had stepped into. For the first time in so long, I felt alive again. Looking back now, I don't know if it was love or something more complicated, something that defies neat definitions. I only know that it happened, that it mattered, that it changed me. Maybe love isn't always about what's right or acceptable. Maybe sometimes it's about the way another person can make you feel like you're breathing fully for the first time in years. So I hold this story close, not as something to be ashamed of, but as something that reminded me I'm still capable of feeling, still capable of wanting. And if you've ever been in a place where you thought that part of you was gone, I hope you find someone, or something, that brings it back to life. If this story has touched you, share it, tell me your thoughts, tell me your truth. Sometimes the most complicated feelings are the ones that show us who we really are. If this story touched your heart or made you feel something real, don't let it just fade away. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment telling me what part stayed with you the most. Your words matter here. They help keep these stories alive and bring more people into this space where honesty and emotion are welcome. And if you're ready for more stories that dare to go where others won't, subscribe now and turn on the bell so you never miss the next chapter.